In this video, we're going to look at different rules for changing constitutions. By definition, a constitution is difficult to change. It is entrenched. We don't want the constitution to be changed easily because we need stability. The very idea of a constitution is that it provides a blueprint for governing, it helps preserve the values of the country, and it also helps constrain majorities. You don't want a newly elected government to completely change the structure or character of a state. But the need for change may arise from time to time. For example, after the American Constitution was ratified, within a few years it became evident that they were missing some parts. A Bill of Rights, protections for individuals against state power. So those amendments were added to the Constitution, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, and so on. Canada had a similar experience. The Constitution Act of 1867 existed to provide a template for governing and divide power between the national government and the provinces. There are very few protections, none really, for individuals. So a constitutional Charter of Rights was added in 1982. These were both examples of constitutional amendments. The original Constitution didn't do something, something needed to be added. And how do you do that? Well, within a Constitution, there is a specific procedure or set of rules that need to be followed in order to make changes to the document. And that's called the amending formula. The amending formula is the process that allows you to make changes to the Constitution. Now, some constitutions are easy to change. We call those flexible constitutions, and others are a little more difficult. We call those rigid. Here's some examples of different rules for changing constitutions. For example, let's say you are a monarchy. It's a country that has a queen, you're a constitutional monarchy, but you want to switch. You want to have an elected president. That requires changing the Constitution. One potential amending rule is legislative supremacy. Basically, a simple majority vote in Parliament would be enough. Now, that's a very low threshold to completely overhaul the type of regime. A little more complicated is intervening election. So an intervening election, let's say Parliament wanted to pass an amendment to get rid of the monarchy. Well, then there needs to be an election, and then a second Parliament would also have to approve the change. So that adds an extra layer to this to ensure that it's supported by the public in a broader sense. We know that because there's been another election and the people have had a chance to weigh in on how they feel about this potential change. If legislative supremacy, simple majority votes are a low threshold, maybe there's something a little more complicated that's needed. Something like a supermajority threshold. So many constitutions have this threshold that in order to change the Constitution, to eliminate the Queen, have a president, you need at least a 3/4 vote in the legislature, or maybe 60% or 2/3, something more than a simple majority. Now, in addition to those, there's sometimes a requirement for ratification by the subnational units. A country like Canada, countries like the United States, it's not enough for the national legislature to approve the change, but it must go to each province, region, or state and have them do it as well. Lastly, popular referendum. In this formula, what you would do is you would ask the people. There would be a simple vote. Everybody in the country gets to vote yes or no. Do you want to approve the constitutional change? So these are different examples of amending formula, rules for changing constitutions. Different countries use different sets of rules. Some of these rules make a constitution very difficult to change. And how do we really assess that? How do we know which ones are tougher than the others? Well, we could measure it by looking at how often a constitution is amended. Call that the amendment rate. How frequently does the Constitution get changed? And then we can also kind of compare that to procedural difficulty. What are the different hoops that need to be jumped through in order to successfully amend the Constitution? Donald Lutz was a researcher that did just that. He compared different amending formula, their complexity, and the amendment rate. And he was able to group constitutions. And he found that some very rigid constitutions, including the United States, Spain, and France, had very complicated amending formulas. Flexible constitutions, like India and New Zealand, had amending formula that were much easier to use. So you can just see that the amendment rate of New Zealand, very, very easy to change that one compared to the United States, much more rigid. He took those amendment rates and he compared them to the different formula to get an idea of the relationship between them, whether some amending formula made for a very flexible constitution and others were tougher that made the Constitution more rigid. And it turns out things like legislative supremacy, simple majority votes, made for a very easy constitution to change. Popular referendums, complicated subnational ratification, those made for very rigid formula. And then there was some middle ground too. But those are really the two extremes. Simple majority, very flexible constitutions. Referendums proved to be among the most rigid. Just review some examples. Canada. The amending formula in Canada, amendment must get passed by the House of Commons, then by the Senate, and then ratification by the provinces. At least 7 provinces, totaling 50%. So, or sometimes it's called the 750 rule, the 2/3 50 rule. That's pretty complicated amending formula. This makes Canada's constitution very rigid. In fact, some provisions even require 10 out of 10 provinces. They require unanimous consent. So this is a very high threshold for an amendment to get through. The United States has a very similar amending formula. House of Representatives, 3/4 vote. The Senate, 3/4 vote. And then 3/4 of the states need to ratify it. Very rigid constitution. And interestingly, the president has no role in constitutional amendments. They don't have a vote. They can't veto it. They're not really part of the process. Compare that to New Zealand. Many parts of the New Zealand constitution can be changed with a simple majority vote in Parliament. There are some things that require a 75% vote or a national referendum, such as changing certain electoral provisions. But one of the things that makes it an easier constitution to amend is that it has a lot of unwritten parts and a lot of constitutional conventions. So New Zealand's constitution is one that's very flexible by comparison. So just to recap, there are lots of different procedures for changing constitutions. We call those the amending formula. And depending on the complexity of the amending formula and the different steps involved, some constitutions might be very easy to change, flexible, and others might be very difficult to change, rigid.